Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I am joined by the boss himself, Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you?
I'm very well, Stephen. It's nice to have a Bruce Springsteen analogy, given the centrality of blue-collar America in the next 48 hours.
There we go. Coming up tonight, Keir Starmer is hiking tuition fees. The US election goes down to the wire. Palestine Action has had a very busy weekend. And the Tories crown a new leader. The government has announced that university tuition fees will rise under Labour for the first time in 8 years. Here's Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson today.
From April 2025, we will be increasing the maximum cap for tuition fees in line with inflation to £9,535, an increase of £285 per academic year. Now, I understand some students may worry about the impact this increase will have on their loan debt. So I want to reassure students already at university, when you start repaying your loan, you will not see higher monthly repayments as a result of these changes to fee and maintenance loans. That's because student loans are not like consumer loans. Monthly repayments depend on earnings, not simply the amount borrowed or interest rates. And at the end of any loan term, any outstanding loan balance, including interest built up, will be written off. Increasing the fee cap has not been an easy decision, but I want to be crystal clear that this will not cost graduates more each month as they start to repay their loans. Universities are responsible for managing their own finances and must act to remain sustainable.
Students in England currently pay £9,250. What Phillipson is proposing is an increase of 3.1% or £285 a year. Phillipson also announced that maintenance loans will rise by 3.1%, which she says will make students about £400 a year better off. This, of course, is still money that has to be paid back. Under the coalition government, tuition fees in England were tripled from £3,000 per year to £9,000 per year in 2012. The Lib Dems ran their 2010 election campaign on a platform of abolishing tuition fees, but once they got into government with the Tories, they threw students under the bus. I actually voted for them that year, one of the biggest regrets of my life. This left the field wide open for Labour to step up as the party who would slash tuition fees, as Ed Miliband promised in 2015, and to scrap them altogether under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And when Keir Starmer ran to be elected as Corbyn's successor, he made a clear promise of continuity. Here's Starmer in 2020.
So obviously in the Labour Party manifestos for the 2017 and 2019 general elections, there were pledges to abolish tuition fees for students. If you became party leader, would you argue for this to be put into the manifesto in the next election?
I would. I think it was a very important manifesto commitment to students.
Abolishing tuition fees was one of the 10 pledges Starmer was elected Labour Party leader on. But just like with the vast majority of his Corbynite promises, he U-turned, consigning abolishing tuition fees to the dustbin along with the wealth tax, the public ownership of water, energy and mail, abolishing the House of Lords, etc., blah, blah, blah. This is what Keir Starmer told Radio 4's Today programme in May last year.
I think we are going to set out a fairer solution. And Justin, so
but it won't be the abandoning of tuition fees, will it?
Well, we are likely to move on from that commitment because
Right.
we do find ourselves in a different financial situation. But I don't want that to be read as us accepting for a moment that the current system is fair or that it's working, because I do think there are other ways of approaching it.
You want to come up with other things, but you're being quite clear. You are going to move on from that pledge.
And move on, Labour certainly have. They've not merely abandoned their promise, they've gone even further and hiked tuition fees to the highest level in British history. Aaron, we've talked about it on this show before. Our universities are in real financial trouble. Is this the answer?
Well, I don't think it's the answer. I mean, that's probably quite a predictable answer coming from me. I also think probably Labour don't think it's the answer. I spoke to the head of finance for a Russell Group university, one of the supposedly best universities in this country. And he basically said to me, this is just before Labour Party conference, that if there wasn't an uptick in student fees, I think he probably was expecting more than this, to be quite frank, more than the 3%. If there wasn't an uptick, his prediction was that around a dozen universities would probably go to the wall in the next 12 to 18 months, or they would need bailouts. And of course, the government made that stern commitment: we will not bail out any HE institutions. Implicitly, according to that guy, that meant that today's news was inevitable. It's important to also remember that about 50% of all universities in England, if I've said the UK before, ignore me. I mean England and Wales, really, but primarily we're talking about England. 50% of all universities in England are running deficits. So they're spending more than they're bringing in. Of course, if you have large capital reserves, etc., no big deal. Many of these institutions don't. They've seen a slight downturn in the number of students coming from overseas. And of course, they've seen increase in cost of living. Their labour costs have gone up because they're having to pay their workers more to maintain their standard of living because of inflation rises over the last several years. And of course, the costs of credit have gone up. So if they had large loans to pay for capital infrastructure, these lovely big buildings they love buying, then a lot of that would have gone up. The costs of servicing that debt would have gone up. So many of these organizations are in deep trouble. I think that's because of exceptionally, in fact, poor executive management in the HE sector over the last 15 years. Many people underqualified and overpaid for what they do. So frankly, pretend to be business CEOs. Park that for a moment. Labour come into office this year. That's the situation they inherit. If I was somebody from a relevant government department or the cabinet, I would say, Stephen, I can hear from your tone of voice you're not particularly pleased with today's news. There's not really much else we can do. Now, if you're being favourable to them, you'd say, well, okay, it's a holding position, but they're not really laying out a vision for beyond it. That kind of sums up Starmerism. But at the same time, there isn't much money around for them to sort out HE because it's a huge problem to solve. Scrapping fees, I think in 2017 it was costed at around 11-12 billion pounds. Obviously, it'd be more than that today. Many of these institutions, like I say, running deficits anyway. They need a lot more money. And so with things like privatized water or with the NHS, it's the exact same with higher education. Labour have inherited a really, really awful situation. That would be their defence. And of course, partly understandable. At the same time, when there are commitments of you on radio, on TV, saying you'd scrap fees, increasing them is a really, really bad look politically.
Yeah, you mentioned there that they don't have a longer roadmap. And I'd be interested to know what you think the solution to the problem with our universities should be. I mean, Phillipson in that clip was so keen to stress that universities are responsible for their own finances. In fact, that's some messaging that was put out by the last government as well. So without talking about, for example, having to bail anything out or renationalising them, I mean, could it be that universities should just be brought under the financial control of a department, for example, and also that perhaps their activities should be, curtailed to their core function, which is education, rather than often landlordism or, investment in student satisfaction style gimmicks on campus?
I think that's entirely right. I think there needs to be a fundamental rethink that recalibrates the strategy of these organizations. They do not exist to be, not every university in this country needs to be world class and, like you say, has to offer, outstanding student satisfaction experience, as if this is the Harrods of higher education. What we need are organizations and institutions in higher education which do two things, as far as I'm concerned. Firstly, that help create free and analytically minded citizens. Freedom and education go hand in hand. The idea of self-authorship, being an active citizen within society, those things are all tied up with one another. And then, of course, people who are qualified to solve the problems, the challenges that we all face over the course of the 21st century. People that, to borrow a phrase from Marxism, are capable of adding social value, doing socially productive work. Now, what I would say is, and I don't think Labour are going to, scrap fees anytime soon. I would say that a short to medium term solution, and I think Labour should frankly put this in their manifesto ahead of the next general election, although I can hear people listening and watching saying, well, what does that matter? Keir Starmer can write stuff down. He doesn't action any of it anyway. But I think Labour could say, look, we are going to cap interest on student loans at 1%, 1.5%. And what that would do is it would basically do something that is called financial repression. You hear this with regards to government spending sometimes. So if the rate of inflation is higher than the rate of interest, then over 10, 20, 25 years, a lot of it just disappears as a result of inflation. That's basically what happened to government debts after the Second World War. They were wound down. They really collapsed, including in this country, not because of austerity or government cuts, but because actually inflation was higher than interest rates, and you had this thing called financial repression. So I think we probably need something like that with regards to student debt. I think we need it with the economy more broadly. But I also think that the government should be looking at scrapping fees in strategically important industries. I think it's crazy, Stephen, that if you want to become a teacher, you do a PGCE, and that can cost around £9,000, and you have to pay for it. Or if you want to become a nurse, you have to pay for it. So I would say, at the very least, we need to be looking at subjects like this, other ones too, probably environmental sciences, agronomy, if we're really serious about food security in the 21st century, engineering probably too. I think we should be looking to scrap fees in these subjects first. And like I said, across the board, just capping interest. That would not be hugely expensive, but I think it would be the first step in moving beyond this system, which we've built in this country since 1997, which we have to be clear here, doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for the students. It certainly doesn't work for the taxpayer. And it doesn't seem to work for universities because they are systematically underfunded. So I think we need a massive rethink here, and it's not going to be cheap and it's not going to be quick.
Systematically underfunded, but also, I think it's important to say, run by a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing a lot of the time. Let's go on to some other Labour news. Keir Starmer has also announced new measures to tackle what he calls the vile trade in people smuggling, to prevent people crossing the Channel in small boats. Here's Starmer at the Interpol conference in Glasgow.
People smuggling should be viewed as a global security threat similar to terrorism. We've got to combine resources, share intelligence and tactics, and tackle the problem upstream, working together to shut down the smuggling routes.
I mean, that is just a massive dog whistle there. A global threat similar to terrorism. Starmer is certainly dialing up the rhetoric there in potentially dangerous ways, and the leader of Reform UK has been quick to take credit for Labour's language. This is a tweet from Nigel Farage. Now Labour are calling the Channel crossing a national security threat. I wonder where they got that from. And he retweets his own tweet from June, where he says the situation in the English Channel is a national security emergency. So how exactly is Labour proposing to end small boat crossings to the UK? Here's Starmer again.
We're going to treat people smugglers like terrorists. So we're taking our approach to counter-terrorism, which we know works, and applying it to the gangs with our new Border Security Command. We're ending the fragmentation between policing, border force, and our intelligence agencies, recruiting hundreds of specialist investigators, the best of the best, from our National Crime Agency, Border Force, Immigration Enforcement, and the CPS and our intelligence agencies, all working together. We're making border protection an elite border force. And not just within our country. We're also working together with international partners, sharing intelligence and tactics. Earlier this year, I visited the headquarters of our National Crime Agency. I saw firsthand the ways we're already collaborating and what it takes to intercept, to disrupt, and destroy these networks. There are so many tools at our disposal. We can seize their phones at the border, identifying and tracing smugglers, wiring payments. We've already trained sniffer dogs to detect the smell of dinghy rubber, and working with Bulgaria, stopped more than 100 small boats upstream long before they made it to the Channel.
We've trained sniffer dogs to smell dinghy rubber. Yeah, very high tech. One of the Labour government's first acts in office was to cancel the Conservatives' flagship Rwanda deportation scheme. It cost the UK taxpayer around £700 million and saw a whole four volunteers deported. And with Labour perhaps keen to move on from the mixed reception of its autumn budget, the government has chosen now as a perfect time to unveil its own approach to Nigel Farage's favourite talking point. Labour is giving the new Border Security Command an extra £75 million a year, taking its funding to £150 million. Serious cash is being spent on surveillance and covert tech, plus specialist investigators and prosecutors. But a former immigration boss isn't impressed.
Kevin Saunders, who's a former chief immigration officer for ports, told this programme the plan wasn't feasible because most of the people smugglers were outside the UK's jurisdiction.
The only ones that you can actually prosecute and send to prison are the ones in the United Kingdom. And the majority of the people smugglers are actually based in the Middle East. He's got to come up with a deterrent to make the migrants not want to come to the UK. If the migrants don't want to come to the UK, the smugglers won't be there to bring them.
So there's the old deterrent idea back on the table. That idea that led to exactly to that botched Rwanda scheme, incredibly cruel scheme as well. Now, nowhere in today's announcement was there any recognition of the reasons why people risk their lives and the lives of their children to make the dangerous channel crossing, nor of how heightened political instability around the world and the worsening impacts of the climate emergency will increase global migration. Nor has there been any acknowledgement or even mention today of the fact that demand for the services of smuggling gangs is directly caused by the lack of safe routes for asylum seekers. There are currently only 3 types of safe and legal routes, so-called, to the UK for those seeking asylum. All 3 are highly restricted, only covering 3 nationalities, and they currently barely function for the few people who are eligible. Aaron, do these answers from Labour sound anything like the right ones to you, or have we just heard it all before?
Well, I thought that contribution from the gentleman on BBC Radio 4 was a pretty, makes you think. You can invest all the money you want into special detectives and prosecutors and anti-terror legislation, but if you're dealing with people primarily outside of a UK jurisdiction, it's pissing in the wind. I mean, this is fundamentally PR, right? And the point you make around climate change is really key. We're going to see huge numbers of displaced peoples on this planet over the course of the century. Some people put a very specific number on it. They say 200 million, 400 million, 600 million by 2050, 60, 70. But the point is we are going to see significant numbers of people being displaced because of climate change. I was talking to Ilan Pape, that interview just went out on Novara's channel yesterday. And, we talked about conflict in West Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean and the possibility of failed states. Pakistan, 200 million plus, Iran, 100 million, Egypt, 100 million, 400 million plus people in these 3 countries alone. And actually, when you listen to, policymakers and politicians and influencers in Britain, they don't really care if those are successful, prosperous countries. Actually, if anything, they often support and advocate for policies which will make those places harder to live in. You'd want to leave them. So, for instance, they say that 2.5 million Gazans should go to Egypt when it already has runaway inflation. They say that Iran should be subject to some of the world's harshest sanctions. And they say in the case of Pakistan that actually, if a democratically elected leader is couped by the military, no big deal. The reality is that the very same politicians who claim to disdain refugees seem to really like creating them. The war on terror created approximately 40 million displaced people. I say this to the right so often, and I think, frankly, they have no reasonable response, which is that all of the Afghans, the Syrians, many of the Iraqis, Iranians, who've come to Europe over the last 15 years is a direct response to Western foreign policy. And then, of course, they would say, well, okay, well, that's in the past. You're being evasive. You're not talking about a real issue. And it's true that regular people in this country really care about. They really care about undocumented migration. My answer would be, well, look, you can create all the new institutions and bodies and interdepartmental thinking you want. But if we continue down this road of failed foreign policy in that part of the world, and we keep on creating more and more failed states, and we keep on thinking that we can sanction countries into political subordination, the problem is only going to get worse. And to make this all the more remarkable, there are some people, Stephen, in sort of foreign policy think tank world in Washington, less so in London, who think actually that we should balkanize Russia, that we should balkanize China. Now, these aren't mainstream views, but there are some people, there are some individuals around the peripheries of things like the Atlantic Council who've said that kind of thing, right? Russia, 150 million people, regime change is needed. Well, if there was regime change in Russia, if you had a failed state in Russia, where do you think people go? And I think it's time we had a common sense discussion, debate around this relationship between undocumented people, mass migration, particularly towards Europe, and our foreign policy. And actually, Europeans need to get with this because the US and the EU are completely unaligned on this. The US can have as wacky a foreign policy as it likes. It can egg on tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of people being displaced because it views itself as being protected by two giant oceans. Europe doesn't have that luxury. We're bordered by the Middle East and North Africa. It's in our rational self-interest for these countries to be safe, to have a rule of law, and to be prosperous. I would love Britain, and I'll finish with this, to have a foreign policy effectively like Brazil's. We have no enemies. We have no quote-unquote natural enemies in the world. And I think that would build up so much more respect for us, and I think actually it would make us a force for good in those precise places which have seen millions leave over the last 20 years. Of course, to do that means a break with US-led foreign policy, a break with Washington, starting in Gaza. Do I expect either major political party to do that? No. Is it in this country's rational self-interest? Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Aaron. And the short-sightedness of not seeing that peace abroad means peace here is obviously going to store up so many problems for us down the road. Problems that are, as you say, so easily foreseeable. And yet those in charge, our leaders, seem either blind to them or sticking their heads in the sand in favor of something like the profit principle, immediate gratification or immediate enrichment. Voters in the US will go to the ballot box tomorrow in what's being billed as one of the tightest races in US election history. That's according to the polls anyway, which over the course of this election have been repeatedly described as either wildly inaccurate or scientific certainties, depending on who they've favored. The big poll today is the New York Times Siena College poll, the last one before voting begins. It gives Harris a single-point lead in the national polls, putting her at 48% to Donald Trump's 47%. But that's pretty much exactly how things stood a week ago. In better news for the Harris camp, the poll also found that she has an 8-point lead over Trump when it comes to those who say they've already voted. Meanwhile, Trump leads with those who say they're likely to vote but haven't yet, i.e., with those who haven't voted. So make of that what you will. But it's in the battleground or swing states where the election is likely to be decided. Those are the states where, at present, either candidate could win, and there are just 7 of them. There are the 4 so-called Sunbelt states in the south and west of the country, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. Nevada and Arizona are worth 6 and 11 electoral college votes respectively, while North Carolina and Georgia have 16 each. That's a combined total of 49 votes. At the moment, Harris appears to have a strong lead in Nevada and a slight lead in North Carolina and Georgia, but all those leads are well within the margin of error for the polls. That's shown by the grey areas on the lines, meaning the Harris camp won't be feeling too confident of victory in those states just yet. Trump, meanwhile, is well ahead in Arizona, a result outside of the margin of error for this poll, so that might give his team a little bit more confidence about what result to expect there. Then there are 3 Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. They hold 10, 15, and 19 electoral college votes respectively for a total of 44 votes. Here the picture is much less clear. Harris has the lead in Wisconsin, but in Michigan and Pennsylvania, the 2 candidates are pretty much tied. And all of these results are still well within the polling margin of error for each state. Now, on Sunday, Kamala Harris campaigned in Michigan. That's a state that Trump won in 2016, with Biden very narrowly winning it back in 2020. But that was in no small part thanks to the support of the state's 250,000 Arab and Muslim voters. Many of them remain unconvinced by the Democrats' stance on Israel's war on Gaza, with Harris turning up to try and win them round.
Given the scale of death and destruction in Gaza, and given the civilian casualties and displacement in Lebanon, it is devastating. And as president, I will do everything in my power to end the war in Gaza.
Now, the problem with that argument, I'll do everything I can to stop war when I'm president, is that throughout this campaign, both Biden and Harris have assured the American people that they're already doing everything they can to stop the genocide. That's a claim that rings a little hollow when millions of dollars of arms exports continue to flow from the US to Israel. Just last week, the Washington Post reported on the nearly 500 reports received by the US State Department alleging that US weapons have been used to kill civilians in Gaza. And yet the State Department has so far taken no action, despite potential violations of domestic US and international law. Meanwhile, Donald Trump hit the stump in Pennsylvania, where he said this.
I have a piece of glass over here, and I don't have a piece of glass there. And I have this piece of glass here, but all we have really over here is the fake news, right? And to get me, somebody would have to shoot through the fake news. And I don't mind that so much, because I don't mind that.
So on the one hand, we've got a candidate who peddles in the violent imagery of journalists being killed while doing their job. And on the other hand, a candidate whose record involves holding a senior role in a government sending weapons to a country that uses them to actually kill journalists. Not that Trump is likely to stem that flow of arms to Israel if he wins. But there is really something here about how inextricably US politics and statehood is intertwined with quite extreme violence, both real and fantasy, and both at home and abroad. Now, Novara Media has, I think for the first time, sent our own team to cover the US elections this year. Producers Jonah Braverman and Jack Barraclough have been traveling the country with Richard Hames. Earlier today, I spoke to a freshly awake Richard from his and Jack's hotel room, and I began by asking him where the team had been so far.
We've been in San Francisco. So Jack Barraclough and I, the videographer for this project, were in San Francisco for other reasons. And we thought that we would track the Halloween party that was going on there. There was a thing called Dance-O-Ween. And the sort of the grimness of Dance-O-Ween, but also the kind of some of the intensity of it, is that it takes place, or at least it starts, in this place in the city that is known as a market at two crossroads. San Francisco has a disastrous homelessness problem, and many homeless people sell whatever it is that they have at this corner. And then on top of this, for one night only, is imposed this quite fun, but very grim in some ways, Dance-O-Ween party that then moves its way around the city with people in fancy dress costumes. Just like, it's an extraordinary picture of the disparity that exists in San Franciscan life, I think. Then we flew from San Francisco to the much more significant state of Michigan, which is where we've been for the last 2 days. Michigan is home to, of course, Detroit, the sort of now post-industrial city that was once famous for making all the cars in America. And that has a particular suburb called Dearborn. Of course, it all feels sort of slightly suburban, enormous, spread out city, impossible to get around without, of course, a car. And in Dearborn, it's significant because it's been called places like America's jihadi capital. It has the highest concentrate of American Muslims in the country, and Arab Americans as well. And we wanted to go and find out there what people are thinking inside that community about this problem that they are facing. At least since the Patriot Act, if not some of them before, Arab Americans have pretty consistently voted Democrat. So the Patriot Act was implemented after 9/11 by George Bush, and that was the sort of the final break with a longer arc of Arab American voting for the Republicans. So since then, Arab Americans have mostly voted for Democrats. That broke quite substantially in this election, because, of course, Harris, under her watch, the Gaza genocide has been prosecuted. And so there's a question for them about what they do. Michigan is a key swing state. It was won and lost by 10 to 40,000 votes in the last two elections. And there are 200,000 Arab Americans, so they can very decisively swing this vote in either way. People have not really been telling us they're going to vote for Trump, a few isolated groups of people. What they've mostly been saying is they're going to either vote down ballot, so not for Harris as president, but for other Democrats down the ballot, because there are lots of races sort of bundled together in this one American election. Or they're going to vote for Jill Stein, right, Jill Stein from the Green Party, who has come out and is a pro-Palestinian candidate in this particular election. While we were at an event that evening, we were met by a Palestinian American man who invited us in the combined traditions of hospitality of the Midwest and, of course, Palestinian hospitality, which is legendary, to go to his family house. And we did that. So yesterday evening, with a Harris rally earlier in the day, we went up to Flint, Michigan, which people might know from the water troubles that were there. Basically, there wasn't clean water in Flint, Michigan for many, many years. He invited us into his home. We met members of his family friends, two of whom had recently come from Gaza. We met a 19-year-old called Yusuf and his father, Abi Yusuf, who explained to us, Abi Yusuf is completely blind, what life had been like in Gaza, in Abi Yusuf's case, a school teacher for the visually impaired Gazans teaching English. And he told us this really heartrending story about how he had left Gaza and the slowness of that, because Yusuf was born in Michigan when Abi Yusuf was in the US briefly, and therefore was an American citizen. And therefore the Americans allowed him, or the Israelis rather, allowed him to evacuate Gaza. But not before, and because there were various delays, the Israelis closed the Rafah crossing. That meant that his sister died, was killed by an Israeli airstrike while they were waiting in that sort of purgery before evacuation. So those were incredibly intense, heartrending stories to hear, and we will hopefully publish them very soon.
So when you've been at those Harris rallies, I guess you've been asking people what are the issues that they're voting for her on? What kind of answers have they been giving you?
We've got answers that mostly relate to reproductive health or abortion access, right, to use less euphemistic term. And then we also got a sense that people didn't really know how to engage with the question of Gaza. We didn't hear, one thing that's very striking, we didn't hear Israel has the right to defend itself. We didn't hear this kind of pro-Israeli rhetoric, but we did hear a lot of quite mealy-mouthed, quite confused rhetoric on what bringing people to the table, having that conversation, building a big tent, being inclusive, and so on. All the kinds of ways in which people attempt to skirt the issue of the genocide.
Harris has made, as you said, there was a rally yesterday. Earlier last week, she sent Bill Clinton to go and stump on her behalf. Do you think either of those things have moved the needle with that US Arab and Muslim population in terms of wanting to vote for her?
That was something that was brought up unprompted, that speech by Bill Clinton, several times in Dearborn, but also it was brought up with this family last night. Another thing they pointed out was that although Harris has run adverts, for example, in Michigan, giving a more sort of pro-Palestinian slant, or at least not as aggressively, pro-genocide slant as she's been elsewhere. In Michigan, where there, of course, is a large Arab American population, at the same time as running those ads, indeed in exactly the same slot, she's run in Pennsylvania adverts in favor of Israel, in favor of Israel's right to defend itself, indeed in favor of Israel's capacity to go further. So there is a great deal of suspicion and a great deal of sort of media literacy out there in the Arab American community who have been consistently lied to over the course of the last 20 years. They are very familiar with the kinds of ways in which people try and buy their support, try and use them as a kind of political tool, and then completely ignore them after the election is done. So I think people are very canny about exactly those kind of questions. Bill Clinton's speech, absolutely disastrous, and Kamala Harris's rhetoric, as far as we saw, is not really cutting through. People are not really just believing it. It seems implausible and indeed just hypocritical.
Yeah, when I was watching that Bill Clinton speech last week, in fact, we did a segment on it, I was just thinking they must think people are so stupid. Not nearly as canny as they actually are. I wanted to zoom out a little bit, Richard, and just talk about the state of the election as a whole. We just got the most recent New York Times poll, which puts everyone pretty much neck and neck everywhere. There's like a small lead for Trump in one or two of the swing states, a small lead for Harris in one or two. They're pretty much split on the national vote. What's the impression that you get from voters about the closeness of this race? Do they feel like it's close, or are people from each side just convinced that their side is going to win?
People don't really seem that convinced, or at least they seem convinced in the way that tells you that they're not really very convinced. Right? There's a kind of a no, we are going to win, we are going to win, we are going to win. And I think one of the reasons why, when we've been putting this question to Harris fans of the genocide, they have been so reluctant to talk about it with us, is because they think of themselves now in the final few days as in an extraordinarily tight race. Just let's focus on the issues we know about. Let's focus on the issues that we know cut through consistently with our base. And of course, some of those are incredibly important issues like abortion access. But there is this sense of needing, at least on the Harris side, to really discipline yourself, because it's in discipline that you get through to these sort of very narrow wins, as you're pointing out. With the Harris people, with the Trump people, I can't say that we know so far. We have met a few Trump voters. There is a deep sense of division in the country. But another thing I will say is that people who we've met who have been Trump voters have not been immensely keen on Trump himself. So walking past the Harris rally, slightly strangely, there were a bunch of, I would say probably in their early 20s guys who are sort of college football fans, college soccer fans, a rare beast out here, but nevertheless, that's what they were. College soccer fans who were wearing Make America Great Again hats. They're wearing Trump merchandise in various forms. And even they were not particularly infused by Trump as a person. They just said that, we're more conservative, but our political system is broken. But we can't really find another conservative who could fill this spot, or just the extreme people in elections get elected. And so there is this profound sense that people are voting mostly out of holding their nose for the other person, I would say. And that has been consistent across the Harris rally as well. We saw this extraordinary thing, the anti-Trump bandwagon. And it was literally a wagon that someone was pulling with loads of badges on. And then at the very top, it says, now featuring Kamala. As if the real politics here is an anti-Trump politics. And then just Kamala Harris is sort of being dropped into it, just kind of placed in there as just the latest avatar of a kind of anti-Trump coalition. As the latest avatar of an anti-Trump coalition.
That's very interesting. Perhaps that's going to be the overall message of this election, no matter who wins, that the political system is broken. Richard, let's stop there. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I hope to see you back in sunny England soon.
That was Richard Hames talking to me from Cleveland, Ohio earlier today. And if you want to have a look at some of the videos the team have been producing, you'll find them on our YouTube page or on novaramedia.com. I really recommend going and having a watch. They're a lot of fun. Now, for those hoping for a Harris win, the weekend did bring some good news. I said earlier that the election would likely turn on the results in the 7 battleground states. But a surprise poll this weekend has sent shockwaves through US election punditry. Kamala Harris has apparently taken an unexpected lead over Donald Trump in Iowa, a state that was key to his 2016 victory. That's according to polling from the Register newspaper in Des Moines, Iowa. The polling was conducted by Ann Seltzer, regarded as one of the US's best pollsters, and it puts Harris 3 points ahead of Trump in a state that was widely expected to stay Republican. Speaking to MSNBC, Seltzer explained why Harris's fortunes may have changed in Iowa.
No one, not including me, would have thought that Iowa could go for Kamala Harris. So what we saw there was striking sort of elaboration of what had happened with our September poll, where we had Kamala Harris closing by 14 points, the gap with Donald Trump. And our analysis then was it wasn't that people are switching their allegiances. It was that more people were qualifying as likely voters in September. That would have been, they say they will definitely vote. And that somebody's asked me, well, is Trump losing ground? And that's an interesting question. And you get out your calculator and start to work that out. There were more respondents, weighted respondents for Trump by three individuals than he had in June. But Kamala Harris got 85. And that's because the influx, the bigger number of likely voters extremely went to Kamala Harris. And this poll is an extension of that the people more likely to show up are her kinds of supporters. So she's got more women, she's got more older people, she's got more college educated people. And it has ended up, you look at the graph of it, it looks pretty linear, that her going from Biden's low point in June up to now, she has leapfrogged over Trump into the lead. So there's lots of things going on, lots of things to speculate there. But obviously we looked hard at these numbers to feel confident in publishing, and we do.
Aaron, this Seltzer poll was literally everywhere this weekend. What's your take on what it's predicting?
It did make me laugh, Stephen, because people, including myself, had never heard of this person before. I view myself as relatively political. We've covered previous elections here on Novara Media. I did a undergraduate, master's degree, PhD, political science. I have American friends. I was taught by American academics. I'd never heard of this person. So I find it quite amusing that large numbers of people, particularly online, bit of tongue in cheek, to be fair to them, who've never heard of this woman, all of a sudden, she has a very good record. I'll go to that more in a minute. But all of a sudden, I trust her with my life, she could look after my kids for a week. They would be in safe hands. That says something about, internet culture, how somebody, one minute you've never heard of, all of a sudden becomes the sort of paragon of trust and credibility the next. But that said, her predictions are really good. The one time she got it badly wrong was in 2018. Even then, it wasn't that badly wrong. If you look at all of her forecasts over the years, even the worst possible mistake, if you apply it to Iowa this time round, I think Trump just about edges it, but it would still mean he loses much of the rest of the Midwest. So either something has gone incredibly wrong with her methodology, which is possible, right? Or Trump's in big trouble. This is not just one poll, one data point. Okay, well, you can ignore it or you can trust it. This person who has been pretty good for so long would have to be so badly wrong for Trump to stand a chance that it almost defies belief. Now, personally speaking, I don't care, right? I have no trust in any particular source of polling, and I think people on the day are going to turn out, and that's what counts, right? And also, by the way, it's really important to say this, that voters who are more likely to vote Democrat are disenfranchised fundamentally. They find it harder to vote. They have fewer places to vote. The queues are longer. It's gerrymandering, frankly, often along racial lines, particularly affects African Americans. But I personally am discounting all of these forecasts and polls until the day itself, because Trump, both in 2016 and 2020, outperformed all of the polls. Now, just to reiterate what I said at the start, this isn't, a poll which you can discard. Like I say, she would have to be so badly wrong that it has no precedent in her work. So I think it should give confidence to the Harris people. And from what I've seen of Trump supporters online, I think it's been a real kick up the arse. I think they're really worried. Somebody I know who covered US elections in terms of ground campaigns said that often a good ground campaign could be the difference of around 6 points. And if you look at the last election in 2020, the Democrats took Georgia, which I think shocked many, many people, purely on the basis of their ground campaign. It could be that their ground campaign, particularly with those voters mentioned in that clip a moment ago, older voters, minorities, women, it could be that their ground campaign has completely swept Trump away. But I also wouldn't be surprised if Trump did really well. I really would not be surprised. I'm old enough to remember that Huffington Post forecast on the day of the 2016 general election, 2016 presidential election rather, which I think gave Trump a 1% chance of winning. And he won actually the Electoral College pretty handsomely. So I personally, I'm taking everything with a giant lump of salt. But I do think they're shook. And I'll just say this. If you look at the data from Puerto Rican voters in Florida, there was one poll out that said 85% of Puerto Ricans are voting Democrat. No surprise there, of course. Latinos generally vote Democrat more, although Trump made some gains in the last election. He's probably going to make some more this time round. But I couldn't help but think, as of course many others noticed online, of that Madison Square Garden event that was held not so long ago. We had a stand-up comedian mocking Puerto Rico as an island of garbage floating in the sea. So, common sense tells you that is not the sort of thing you should be saying to a decent chunk of the electorate. There's hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans in swing states. That's what common sense tells you. But then, of course, nothing about the two Trump campaigns were commonsensical. And it's really important to say, even though he lost to Biden in 2020, Trump got the most votes of any candidate to ever lose in a presidential election. He got a hell of a lot more votes than he did in 2016. And I think that really shocked lots of people, particularly given the media coverage of the Trump presidency for 4 years prior to that. So nothing will surprise me at this point, Stephen. If it was a Harris landslide, I would not be surprised. If Trump won and won decently, I also wouldn't be surprised. But this is a really, really interesting poll, and it can't be ignored.
I personally feel a lot less sure about this election than I did in 2016, because I remember in 2016 driving across country 8 years ago, on the Monday night before the election in that year, and thinking about what was going to happen. And it just suddenly struck me that there was this one single issue that would unite so many Republicans behind Trump, and that was the Supreme Court. And I went to bed on the Tuesday night knowing I was going to wake up to a Trump presidency. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. But this time around, there doesn't seem to be that kind of single galvanizing campaigning issue to unite people behind Republicans of all stripes. Whereas at least Harris has the, not Trump line, as well as reproductive rights, which I think are galvanizing Democrats in a totally different way to the way that Trump's promises are galvanizing Republicans. So, if you had to read the tea leaves, Aaron, what would you say? I know people don't like giving predictions, but yeah, what would you think?
Well, put it this way: the last time the Republicans won the popular vote was in 2004 with George W. I don't think they've only won the popular vote. Well, obviously before that you have his dad. So it's been twice since 88. So on that basis, you presume the Democrats are going to win the popular vote. I personally think that winning the popular vote and the grand campaign, and you're right, on the reproductive rights issue, I think that gets them over the edge. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few shock results. If the Republicans do surprisingly well in one or two states we weren't expecting. And I also wouldn't be surprised, by the way, if the Democrats flip somewhere, which, absolutely nobody sees coming. But I'm with you. Look, if somebody said, Aaron, everything you have is on this, throw of the dice, what's it going to be? I would say Harris.
Well, it's all to play for over the next few days. We'll, of course, be covering every moment of the election over. Well, not every moment, obviously. Every show will be covering everything that happens in the elections over the next few days. Palestine Action has targeted 4 sites connected to Israel over the weekend in their ongoing campaign against British companies and organizations thought to be complicit in Israel's war on Gaza. 2 sculptures of Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, were, in the group's words, abducted from the University of Manchester. Weizmann was a central figure in securing the Balfour Declaration from the British government, a catalyst for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Not to worry, though, the statues are quite safe and now clad in the mantles of Palestinian liberation. Activists and students also targeted the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge University. They say the institute continues to work with British companies implicated in the genocide, including Rolls-Royce, Siemens, and BAE Systems. Also targeted were the London offices of the Jewish National Fund, described by Haaretz, a newspaper, as a settler organization in every respect. It's accused of funding the dispossession of Palestinians from their territories. There was another action at the London offices of the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, also known as BICOM. The Guardian described the lobbying group as, quote, one of the most persistent and slickest media operations in the battle for influence over opinion formers. Those actions fell on the 107th anniversary of the signing of the Balfour Declaration, and they led to an angry response from some. The Board of Deputies of British Jews released this statement. All thinking people should condemn the thuggery and vandalism in London, Manchester, and Cambridge this Shabbat by the Palestine Action Group. The defacement of buildings housing British Jewish charities and university property is intended to harass and intimidate. The environment it creates serves to make many Jews feel targeted and unsafe in this country and ruins the public realm for the law-abiding public. This tragic war began when Hamas began a campaign of murder and hostage-taking, with hostages remaining in Gaza. For Palestine Action to boast about abduction, as they did in one of their attacks, exposes the extremism of this group, which is intolerable in a free society. These actions must be punished with the full force of the law, and we will be working with government, police, and university authorities to ensure that a firm line is drawn between legitimate protest and violent extremism. Posting about the BICOM action, actress Tracy Ann Oberman made this comparison. So I always wondered what it would be like living in Nazi Germany. Today I walked into my local high street and found this, with no police presence at all. A Jewish owner building smashed windows and daubed in red paint. I'm shaking with fear and rage. Old people flat next door, also spattered. Where is this going to end? Those actions followed a remarkable and hard-won success by Palestine Action announced last week. After a long-running campaign by Palestine Action, Barclays Bank finally offloaded all shares in Israeli arms company Elbit Systems. Earlier today, I was joined by Max Geller, spokesperson for Palestine Action. I began by asking him about the group's actions this weekend.
The most prominent one we took action against was the Jewish National Fund. The JNF, when you target the JNF, you target the central logic of Zionism. That is the racist administration of the land of Palestine. Since its founding, the JNF has settled land for the benefit of Jews only. This underlines the apartheid practices of the entire state. And at this point, 13 months into the genocide, Palestine Action has decided that any blatant symbols of Zionism will be targeted.
And what form did those actions take?
We mostly sprayed blood red paint all over the building facades.
And yeah, you've had quite a lot of reaction. The Board of Deputies of British Jews said that the actions were designed to harass and intimidate British Jews. Tracy Ann Oberman, the actress, posted a picture of the Hillsdown House action and seemed to compare it to living in Nazi Germany. What do you make of those reactions and those comments from those people?
Listen, we are living through the very end of the time where we have to take these people seriously. Soon, the dust will settle. The real death count of the Gaza genocide will come to light. And the monsters who have obfuscated what's been happening for the last year will be held to account. The idea that targeting a building is more important than what's happening in Gaza is just insane. And I don't have a lot to say in response to discredited organizations like the Board of Deputies or to Ms. Oberman.
Let's move on to a recent success, which is the divestment by Barclays from Elbit, an arms manufacturer that Palestine Action has repeatedly targeted over the last year. Tell me how that came about and how you feel about it.
I mean, it's really great news. I think it's important for your audience to understand just how serious Palestine Action has been taking its Barclays campaign. Over the last year, we have targeted this bank over 50 times. Right now, as we speak, Palestine Action has members who are incarcerated in British prisons for the brave actions they have taken against this bank. It is a momentous win, but it's not one that came easily or one that we take lightly. The most important thing to understand is that we will be targeting any company who helps facilitate this genocide. And Elbit, Israel's largest weapons exporter, has been doing business here in the UK uninterrupted for far too long. What's really what I'm most sort of proud about is Palestine Action's ability to hit this bank repeatedly and also simultaneously. At one night, over 20 different bank branches were targeted. For about a month in Manchester, one of the UK's largest cities, we have rendered Barclays banks inoperable. There was not a Barclays bank available to Manchester residents for almost a month's time, and I think that's what led to this remarkable victory.
So I should put it to you that Barclays denies that they've divested. They say that they don't hold any investments, but are rather acting as agents for other investors. What do you make of that claim?
I appreciate the question, but from their own statement, they made clear that in one SEC filing, they had 3.4 million pounds worth of shares, and they no longer do. Not only that, following our direct action campaign, the Barclays officials started publicly commenting on us. This hasn't happened in the history of Palestine targeting of banks whatsoever. So I think once again, we can see that direct action gets the goods.
Yeah, absolutely. And also direct action, as you said earlier, comes with many costs. I think there are 16 of your activists currently imprisoned, many more awaiting trial. What is life like for them? And what comment do you have on that?
I mean, I really appreciate the question, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and talk about these political prisoners that we have. These are the most noble, brave, lovely people that some of whom I've actually met. These people are incarcerated for trying to stop this genocide with their own hands. And I know for some of your audience, Palestine Action's tactics may seem drastic, but I have to insist to you that these 16 people are just as vivacious and important to their communities and just as loved by their friends as you and me and as you and me are by ours. And their incarceration represents just as much of a tragedy and an emergency as if you or I were arrested for standing up for what's right. This war on Palestine has started to come home here in the UK. We have nurses missing their NHS shifts. We have teachers missing their classrooms because instead of doing their jobs, they are locked up in jail cells simply for trying to prevent more Palestinian death. It's extremely important that we as a domestic movement to stop this genocide also start foregrounding our political prisoners, because if we in the UK don't do it, no one else will either.
What can our audience do to support those, as you say, political prisoners, or to support Palestine Action if they don't feel they can get directly involved?
There are numerous ways. I mean, we're always raising money, and you can log on to our website to donate. You can also write to our political prisoners, and we're also we've been demonstrating outside of several of the jails where our prisoners are being held. Some of them are experiencing extremely repressive conditions. I would encourage any of your viewers who are engaged in prisoner support in general to get involved with the Palestine Action prisoners. We have seen incredible solidarity between Palestine Action prisoners and other incarcerated UK political prisoners, like people from Just Stop Oil and like the incredible folks at Cage. So there are people who are doing prison work are starting to see that our causes are linked.
That was Max Geller, spokesperson for Palestine Action. It's taken 4 long months, but the Conservative Party have finally crowned their new leader. Here's Kemi Badenoch giving her victory speech.
It is the most enormous honour to be elected to this role, to lead the party that I love, the party that has given me so much. I hope that I will be able to repay that debt. Our party is critical to the success of our country, but to be heard, we have to be honest. Honest about the fact that we made mistakes. Honest about the fact that we let standards slip. The time has come to tell the truth.
A day later, however, Badenoch seemed less than thrilled to be asked about what this truth might be. Here's what she said to Laura Kunsberg.
One of the things that's very important is that we draw a line under all that happened over the last 14 years. We've lost an election, a historic defeat, and simply churning over every single incident, I don't think is going to be helpful for dealing with where we are today.
So if you want to draw a line then, what is the truth about what went wrong with Liz Truss? Was it recklessness? Do you think that perhaps as the new leader, in order to move on, you should say sorry to the public about the turmoil that caused?
Well, Laura, what I'm here to do is talk about how I'm going to be leading the Conservative Party. We can have a post-mortem on each and every Prime Minister over the last 14 years, but I don't think that that's particularly helpful for your viewers. There will be a post-mortem. There's plenty of time for us to think about how we can improve the offer that we have for the public.
You stood on a platform yesterday and said it was time to tell the truth about what went wrong with your party.
Yes.
So,
and I have said that. But what I'm not going to do is sit down and go through line by line every single thing that everybody did wrong.
I'm just asking you what went wrong with Liz Truss, who was in power for a matter of weeks, who caused huge economic turmoil, who lots of people in your party said was disastrous for your prospects. So I'm just asking you what you think the truth is on what went wrong. We don't have to go on and on about it. Just brief it. What do you think went wrong?
But the point I'm making is that we had a historic defeat. I stood up yesterday and said that we need to be honest, that we got things wrong. What I don't want to do this morning is start listing all of the things we got wrong. There's plenty of time to do that. What I'm here to do is set out how there's going to be a change under my leadership.
It's time to tell the truth. It's time to be honest, but only for 20 minutes. Kemi Badenoch is a vocal opponent of critical race theory and trans rights, a self-proclaimed gender-critical feminist who admitted to hacking Labour grandee Harriet Harman's website. She was accused of bullying and traumatising staff while business secretary, allegations she denied. And during her leadership campaign, she made comments attacking maternity pay, the minimum wage, and children with autism. Following her victory, she's also managed to upset and alienate the bereaved relatives of the COVID dead.
A lot of the stuff that happened around Partygate was not why I resigned. I thought that it was overblown. We should not have created fixed penalty notices, for example. That was us not going with our principles.
The public wrong to be upset about Partygate? You say it was overblown.
No, they were not wrong to be upset about Partygate. The problem was that we should not have criminalised everyday activities the way that we did. People going out for walks, all of them having fixed penalty notices. That was what ended up, creating a trap for Boris Johnson.
But wasn't the problem that people in government didn't obey the rules?
Yes, that's right. People in government didn't obey the rules, but they were not MPs. They were often staffers. And I think that the way that we had created those regulations ended up entrapping...
The Prime Minister and the Chancellor both got fines. It wasn't just people who worked for them.
Indeed. But as we saw with those events, when people see the full story of what actually happened, they understand that things were created, problems were created because of the way that we had created the regulations.
Kemi Badenoch is the first black woman, indeed first black person, to lead a political party in Britain. Here's how she feels about achieving this milestone.
People across the political spectrum have lauded the fact that you're the first black leader of a UK political party. But you've previously said that you don't think we should overemphasise race, we shouldn't overemphasise identity. But I just wonder, what do you think of it as a milestone? You know what it's like for you when other people stand up and say, that's so marvellous. But what do you feel when you hear that?
So I think that the best thing will be when we get to a point where the colour of your skin is no more remarkable than the colour of your eyes or the colour of your hair. We live in a multiracial country, and that is great, but we have to work very hard to make sure that it doesn't become something divisive, where people see themselves as being part of groups rather than all being British. So when I hear people say, isn't this remarkable, we have a black female leader of the Conservative Party, I'm glad because it shows that my country and my party are actually places where it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like. It's about what the offer is. What I don't want is for that to be the thing that ends up being talked about. I find it astonishing that Rachel Reeves keeps talking about how she's the first female chancellor, which in my view is a very, very low glass ceiling within the Labour Party, which she may have smashed, nowhere near as significant as what other women in this country have achieved.
Aaron, Kemi Badenoch quite quickly became one of the front runners in the leadership race, and now she's taken the crown. Is this a fresh start, a new page for the Tory party?
It could be. I mean, I'll start with this. When Jeremy Corbyn was elected as leader of the Labour Party in 2015, I don't think anybody thought, including his biggest supporters, that there would be a general election within 2 years and that Labour, under his leadership, would secure a 10% increase in their share of the vote. The biggest increase in any party's share of the vote since 1945, under Labour, incidentally, with Clement Attlee. I don't think anybody, including his supporters, thought that Keir Starmer in 2020 would form a government within 4 years and that his majority would be one of the biggest on record. You know, the majority that Labour won in July this year isn't quite on a par with Blair in 97, not far behind though. But he does have a bigger majority than Thatcher won in 79, 83 or 87. I don't think anybody would have predicted that in 2020. So that's the first place to start with. You know, it's easy to sort of write people off or dismiss them or disregard them. But it's early days and people surprise you. That's the point of politics, right? We don't all know what's coming. And not all of this is particularly predictable. Things can happen like COVID, like an economic crisis, like a scandal. However, it does seem to me that Kemi Badenoch winning the Tory leadership is an outcome which potentially is the best case scenario, not just for reform, not just for the Greens, not just for the Lib Dems, but for Labour too. In other words, all of the other parties potentially benefit from Badenoch winning rather than Robert Jenrick. There was polling actually which confirms this. So while Badenoch led as the preferred Prime Minister candidate amongst Tory members, and of course they're the people who matter, they just voted in this contest, amongst every other party, Jenrick was seen more favourably than her. So on reform, for instance, I think her position on the ECHR is going to be torn to shreds by Farage. Jenrick said that we need to leave. She has not said that. With the Green Party, I think she's just simply far more coded as on the hard right than Jenrick. I think she's going to have a harder time getting Labour voters in the Red Wall. And I think she's going to have a really hard time with Lib Dem voters. You know, near me, there's a place called Bishop's Waltham in Hampshire, rural Hampshire. It's of a piece with the kinds of seats that the Lib Dems picked up in the general election. Places like, Winchester, Chichester, further into the southwest, into Devon and so on, Jacob Rees-Mogg's seat. That kind of place. The Tories lost that in a council by-election. I think it was last week. And so I look at that. I look at the Tories having to fend off reform. I look at the Greens potentially challenging them in some rural seats, right? Like Waveney Valley. And I look at Labour, and I think actually Badenoch could be exposed on all of those fronts. But, she's only been in the job 2 minutes. Us here at Novara Media, or we here at Novara Media rather, we don't like to just parrot whatever talking points you hear elsewhere in the media. People like to come to their conclusions very quickly. My instinct is she's going to have a very hard time. She's going to have a very hard time to get back the donors, to win back centrist media, to win back people like the BBC, because she's coded as too radically, culturally right-wing. I also should say, by the way, I don't believe in the identity politics argument. Isn't it wonderful that a person of color is now X, Y, Z? But this is a woman who's of Nigerian heritage leading one of the oldest parties in Europe. I think maybe the oldest continuous political party in Europe. Tories have been around in their present form since 1834. I mean, it is a tremendous accomplishment. It just is. It reflects positively on the country, I think. People are welcome to disagree. That's not a reason to vote for her. And it's also true that a politician on the right who's brown or black has more license to enact policies which may be particularly bigoted or repressive, particularly against minorities. That's true. But I also do think it's a positive thing that somebody of Nigerian heritage can lead a political party. That's not happened before. It wasn't really possible 30, 40 years ago. It now is. I think that's a positive thing and a sign of progress. But politically, I do suspect she's going to struggle. And the people who are licking their lips with all of this are Reform. She is the ideal candidate for Farage. I think Jenrick would have caused them real problems in trying to build on their vote from July. I think they view Kemi Badenoch as a slightly easier character to overwhelm.
I think you're right there. I mean, of all the candidates, I actually find her the most, I was going to say interesting, but I think I mean entertaining. Like, I quite enjoy watching a Kemi Badenoch interview. You know, she has this kind of, sort of haughty, aristocratic sort of bearing sometimes. She's very snappy. But I think you're totally right about how the other parties are going to triangulate around her. I mean, she's someone who's just like completely addicted to culture wars. And I feel like that's something that we've moved on from. And insofar as we haven't, it's already the territory of Reform. So the Tory party really probably does need to do something different. Maybe she'll be the person who'll do it. But as you say, from where I stand at the moment, it doesn't look like she will be. All right, Aaron, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
My pleasure, Stephen. You did a fantastic job. Lots of positive comments. Let's make this a regular thing.
Well, let's see. But thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Do come back tomorrow for another live show. Until then, you've been watching Novara Live.